The light is dying now, slipping through the window in long amber fingers that stretch across my bedroom floor. I sit on the edge of my bed, holding something that doesn't belong to me. A shirt, navy blue cotton, soft from too many washes, still carrying the faint scent of sandalwood and something indefinable that is purely him. Elliot. I should have given it back weeks ago. Should have tossed it in a bag with the other forgotten things that accumulate when two people spend too much time in each other's spaces. Instead, I kept it, folded it carefully, and placed it in my dresser drawer like some kind of talisman, some proof that the moments we've shared actually happened. The fabric is warm between my fingers now, warmed by my own touch, but I can still catch traces of him if I breathe deeply enough. It makes my chest tighten in a way I'm not entirely ready to name. Earlier today, we were lying on his couch, the afternoon stretching lazy and golden around us. Some documentary about ocean currents played on his laptop, but neither of us was really watching. I was sketching in the margins of a magazine, absent lines that meant nothing, while Elliot lay with his head tilted back, eyes closed, humming something under his breath. His shirt had ridden up slightly, exposing a strip of pale skin above his jeans, and I found myself tracing that line with my eyes before I could stop myself. He caught me looking. Of course he did. Elliot has always been good at noticing the things I try to hide. "You've ruined me for girls," he said, the words tumbling out half joking, half something else entirely. He was smiling when he said it, that crooked smile that starts small and spreads slow across his face like spilled honey. But his eyes held mine a beat too long, and there was something in them that made my breath catch. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. Told him he was being dramatic, that he'd always been dramatic. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt something electric shoot through my chest, some recognition that we had crossed a line we'd been dancing around for months. He didn't look away. That was the thing that undid me. He held my gaze and smiled like what he'd said was a gift instead of a confession, like ruining someone could be the most generous thing you could do for them. Now I'm alone in my apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery, breathing in the lingering scent of tomorrow's bread mingling with the ghost of Elliot's cologne on this shirt, and I can't stop replaying that moment. The way his voice dropped when he said it. The way he didn't take it back or laugh it off the way we usually do when one of us ventures too close to something real. My phone buzzes against the nightstand. A text from him, probably. He's been sending me songs all evening. Links to things that make him think of me, he says. I don't reach for it. Not yet. I'm not ready to pretend this afternoon didn't happen, to slip back into the careful choreography of our friendship like we haven't been slowly destroying each other for months. The truth is, I don't know when it started. When did our easy companionship become this gravitational pull that leaves me checking my phone every few minutes, hoping his name will light up the screen? When did movie nights become exercises in restraint, both of us careful not to let our hands brush when reaching for the same bowl of popcorn? When did I start memorizing the sound of his laugh, the way his voice gets softer when he's tired, the particular shade of brown his eyes turn in lamplight? I fold the shirt and set it on my dresser, but I don't put it away. Instead, I lean back on my bed and stare at the ceiling, at the water stain that looks like a bird in flight if you squint just right. Outside, the city hums its evening song, car horns and distant music and the murmur of people living their lives. Normal people with normal problems and normal desires that don't keep them awake at night wondering what it means to ruin someone. Elliot Vance, 25 years old, all restless energy and crooked charm, hands that move when he talks and a voice that gets rough when he sings. He bartends downtown at some place with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, the kind of place where young professionals go to feel bohemian for a few hours. But what he really wants is to make music, to fill rooms with his words and melodies and watch people's faces change when they hear something that speaks to them. I've seen him perform twice now. Small venues, open mic nights where the audience is mostly other musicians and their friends. Both times, I stood in the back with my arms crossed, trying to look casual while my heart hammered against my ribs. There's something about watching him on stage that feels almost intimate, like I'm seeing a part of him he doesn't show in daylight. His voice carries differently in those dark spaces, becomes something richer and more vulnerable. After his first set, he found me by the bar and asked what I thought. I told him he was good, better than good, and he smiled so wide I thought he might split in half. Then he bought me a drink, and we talked until closing about everything and nothing. And when we finally stumbled out into the night air, he slung his arm around my shoulders like it was the most natural thing in the world. That should have been my first clue. The way it felt natural. The way I didn't want him to let go. We met at Sarah's housewarming party 6 months ago. I almost didn't go. Would have stayed home with takeout and Netflix if Sarah hadn't practically dragged me there herself. I was standing in her kitchen, nursing a beer and making small talk with people I barely knew, when I heard someone laugh. Really laugh. The kind that starts in your belly and bubbles up until it takes over your whole body. That was Elliot. He was sitting on Sarah's couch with a guitar in his lap, playing something soft while a small circle of people gathered around him. When our eyes met across the room, he smiled and nodded like we were old friends, like he'd been waiting for me to show up. I stayed until 3 in the morning. We all did. Something about the music, about the way Elliot could make a room feel smaller and warmer just by existing in it, kept us anchored there long past the point where parties usually dissolve. When he finally put the guitar down and started helping Sarah clean up, I found myself picking up empty bottles and folding chairs I hadn't been asked to fold, just so I didn't have to leave yet. He asked for my number as we were walking to our cars. Said maybe we could grab coffee sometime, talk about music. I gave it to him without hesitation, even though I knew coffee would turn into something more complicated. Even though I could already feel the first threads of whatever this would become wrapping themselves around my chest. The coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into a concert. The concert turned into hours spent in his cluttered apartment, surrounded by instruments and notebooks filled with half-finished songs. Before I knew it, he had become a constant presence in my life, someone I texted when something funny happened, someone whose opinion I sought when making decisions both small and large. Just friends, I told people when they asked. Just friends, I told myself when I caught my reflection smiling after reading his texts. Just friends don't feel this way, some part of me whispered back, but I ignored it. I've gotten good at ignoring the parts of myself that want things I'm not sure I'm allowed to have. My phone buzzes again. This time I reach for it. The text is simple. Playing tomorrow night at the Mercury. You should come. I stare at the screen until the words blur. Tomorrow night. Another chance to stand in the back of some dimly lit room and watch him become someone magnificent. Another chance to pretend my heart doesn't stop when he looks for me in the crowd. I type back. I'll be there. Because I will be. Because I always am. Because somewhere along the way, Elliot Vance became the center of gravity in my small, careful world, and I'm not sure I remember how to exist without that pull. The shirt sits on my dresser like an accusation. Evidence of how far we've already gone. How much I've already let him matter. Tomorrow night, he'll sing, and I'll watch, and we'll pretend we're still just friends, still safe in the space between wanting and having. But something has shifted. I can feel it in the air between us, in the way he held my eyes when he said I'd ruined him. Maybe we've been ruining each other all along, slowly and sweetly, and maybe that's not such a terrible thing to be. Outside, the last of the daylight fades, and the city settles into night. I close my eyes and try to imagine what tomorrow will bring, but all I can see is Elliot's smile, slow and deliberate and not breaking eye contact. Like ruining someone could be the kindest thing you could do. I've lived above Mrs. Chen's bakery for 3 years now, and I still wake up to the smell of rising dough and cinnamon. It's a small apartment, just big enough for one person who doesn't collect too many things or invite too many people over. The kitchen window looks out onto 3rd Street, where morning commuters hurry past with their coffee cups and determined expressions. My desk sits by that window, covered in sketches and color swatches and the detritus of a career that pays the bills but doesn't set my soul on fire. Graphic design for Hartwell and Associates. Business cards for law firms, brochures for accounting offices, the occasional restaurant menu when I'm lucky. It's steady work, the kind that lets me pay rent and buy groceries without drama. My boss, Jennifer, is pleasant enough in that professional way that maintains appropriate boundaries. My coworkers are friendly but not friends, the kind of people you make small talk with in the break room but don't text on weekends. It's a neat life. Predictable. Safe in its ordinariness. Every Sunday, my father calls from the house where I grew up, 3 hours north in a town where everyone knows everyone else's business. He asks about work, about whether I'm eating enough vegetables, about when I'm going to find a nice girl and settle down. The conversation follows the same pattern every week. comfortable in its repetition. He means well, I know that. But there's something in his voice when he mentions the nice girl, something hopeful and expectant that makes my chest tighten. I've brought exactly 2 women home to meet him. Rachel, who worked at the coffee shop near my old apartment and had a laugh like wind chimes. And Sarah, before she became the Sarah who threw housewarming parties and collected strays like me. Both times, my father lit up in a way that made me feel guilty for reasons I couldn't name then. Both relationships faded quietly, not from any lack of caring, but from some fundamental absence of the spark I kept thinking would ignite if I just tried harder. My life before Elliot was a series of almosts. Almost relationships, almost passions, almost moments of genuine connection that somehow never quite solidified into something real. I told myself I was selective, that I had high standards, that the right person would come along eventually. I told myself a lot of things that were easier than examining why nothing ever felt quite right. Elliot's apartment is chaos compared to mine. 15 minutes across town in the Arts District, above a vintage record store that plays jazz too loudly on Saturday afternoons. His living room is a maze of instruments and notebooks, guitar cases leaning against walls, a keyboard that doubles as a dining table when he remembers to eat. Sheet music covers every surface, some of it his, most of it other people's songs he's trying to learn, marked up with his own notes and interpretations. He lives like someone who's never learned to apologize for taking up space. Books stacked in precarious towers, coffee mugs that have been repurposed as pencil holders, a couch that's more cushions than frame where he sleeps when he falls asleep writing. It should feel overwhelming, but instead it feels alive in a way my careful apartment never does. He bartends 4 nights a week at Meridian, one of those places downtown where the drinks have names like Existential Crisis and the Hemingway Special. The clientele is mostly young professionals who want to feel artistic and actual artists who need somewhere affordable to drink. Elliot moves behind the bar like he's performing, all easy conversation and precise movements, remembering everyone's orders and somehow making each person feel like they're the most interesting customer he's served all night. But what he really wants is the music. He writes constantly, melodies that come to him in dreams, lyrics scribbled on napkins and the backs of receipts. He plays the open mic circuit, testing new material on small crowds, building a following one song at a time. There's a recklessness to his ambition that both terrifies and fascinates me, the way he's willing to pour his heart out in front of strangers and hope they understand. We fell into friendship the way some people fall into love, gradually and then all at once. After that first night at Sarah's party, we started texting. Nothing profound at first, just links to songs we thought the other might like, observations about the weather or the peculiar behavior of pigeons. But somehow those surface conversations deepened, became explorations of the things we cared about, the things that kept us awake at night. Movie nights became a regular occurrence. Elliot introduced me to films I'd never heard of, foreign movies with subtitles and complicated emotions, documentaries about musicians who died too young. I showed him the comfort movies I'd grown up with, the ones my mother and I used to watch together before she got sick, before everything became about hospitals and careful conversations in waiting rooms. Road trips happen without planning. One Saturday, Elliot decided he needed to see the ocean, and somehow I found myself in his passenger seat with a hastily packed bag and no particular destination. We drove until we ran out of land, spent the night in a motel with thin walls and thinner towels, and talked until sunrise about everything and nothing. On the drive back, he played me demos he'd recorded on his phone, rough sketches of songs that weren't ready for anyone else to hear. The boundaries of our friendship expanded to include things that maybe weren't quite friendship anymore, though neither of us said so out loud. Sleeping on each other's couches became normal. So did the way we could communicate in glances across crowded rooms, the way we knew each other's coffee orders and movie preferences, and the particular expressions that meant someone was having a bad day. I started designing things inspired by his lyrics, abstract illustrations that tried to capture the emotions his words evoked. He never asked me to, and I never showed them to him, but something about his music demanded visual response. I'd find myself sketching while he played, trying to translate melody into line and color. Our friends assumed we were together long before we did. Sarah started inviting us to things as a unit, and other people stopped asking if either of us was dating anyone. We let it happen, this quiet assumption, because correcting it felt more complicated than the truth deserved. But there were moments when the careful choreography of our friendship revealed its limitations. Moments when our hands would brush reaching for the same thing, and we'd both freeze like we'd touched something electric. Silences that stretched too long, loaded with things we couldn't quite say. The way he'd look at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like he was trying to solve some puzzle I didn't know I'd presented. I told myself it was normal, this intensity. Close friendships were supposed to feel important, supposed to matter. But late at night, alone in my neat apartment above the bakery, I wondered if other people's friendships came with this particular weight, this sense of standing on the edge of something vast and unnamed. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee and staring at a logo design that refused to cooperate. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, and Elliot's name lit up the screen with the kind of message that changes everything without announcing itself as significant. "There's this festival," he wrote. "Small thing, about 2 hours north. They have an open stage on Saturday night, and I got a slot. Wanna come?" I read it 3 times before responding. Elliot had been writing for months, playing small venues around the city, but this felt different somehow. Bigger. The kind of opportunity that could mean something if it went well. Of course, I typed back and hit send before I could overthink it. The festival was called Riverbend, one of those intimate gatherings that happen in small towns trying to attract weekend tourists. Food trucks and craft booths scattered across a park that sloped down to the water, families with children running between the vendors while a steady rotation of musicians took the stage. We arrived Friday evening and checked into a motel that had seen better decades, 2 beds separated by a nightstand and the kind of carpet that had absorbed too many stories. Elliot was nervous in a way I'd never seen before. He kept pulling out his guitar to tune it, then putting it away again, fingers tapping restless rhythms against his thigh. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed going over his set list for the 100th time while I pretended to read a magazine I'd bought at a gas station. "What if no one cares?" he said suddenly, his voice smaller than usual. "They will," I told him, and meant it. How could they not? Saturday passed in a blur of wandering between booths and listening to other performers, Elliot critiquing their technique while I watched the way he absorbed everything, filing it away for later use. As evening approached and his slot drew closer, his nervousness transformed into something sharper, more focused. I recognized the look from nights when he'd played at Meridian, but amplified, like the stakes had suddenly gotten higher. The sun was setting when he took the stage, golden light filtering through the trees to paint everything in soft amber. I found a spot near the back, far enough away to give him space, but close enough to catch his eye if he needed the anchor of a familiar face. The crowd was smaller than the afternoon audiences had been, maybe 50 people scattered across blankets and folding chairs, but they were the kind of people who stayed for music, who came to festivals to discover something new. Elliot adjusted the microphone and looked out over the audience, his gaze finding mine for just a moment before he began. The first song was one I knew, something he'd been working on for months about leaving small towns and chasing dreams. His voice carried differently in the open air, seemed to find corners and spaces I hadn't known existed. The crowd settled into that particular stillness that happens when people recognize they're hearing something special. But it was the second song that undid me completely. I'd never heard it before. The melody was softer than his usual style, more vulnerable, and when he began to sing, I felt something shift in my chest like a lock turning. The lyrics were about discovery, about someone who cracked open what I thought I knew and left me unafraid of falling, about finding home in unexpected places, about the way some people change you just by existing in your orbit. Our eyes met during the bridge, and something passed between us that was too heavy for the space we were in, too significant for the casual friendship we'd been pretending to maintain. The rest of the audience seemed to fade away, became background to a conversation we were having without words. He sang about ruin and rescue being the same thing, about learning to want something you never knew you needed, and I felt every word like a confession meant only for me. When the song ended, the applause felt distant, muffled. Elliot finished his set with something upbeat, something that let the crowd clap along and smile, but I barely heard it. I was still caught in the web of that second song, still processing the way he'd looked at me while singing about falling. After his performance, people approached him with compliments and questions, the kind of response every musician hopes for. I hung back, giving him space to bask in the attention he deserved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. That song hadn't been accidental. Those lyrics, that eye contact, the way my name seemed to hover unspoken in every verse. Eventually, the crowd dispersed, and it was just us, sitting on a picnic table behind the stage while the festival wound down around us. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of barbecue smoke and river water. Elliot had his guitar across his lap, picking out random melodies while we watched vendors pack up their booths. That song, I started to say, then stopped. How do you ask someone if they wrote a love song about you without sounding presumptuous? How do you acknowledge that level of vulnerability without matching it? Elliot looked up from his guitar, and in the fading light, his expression was softer than I'd ever seen it. He was quiet for a long moment, like he was gathering courage for something. "You've ruined me for girls," he said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. It was supposed to sound casual, I think, the kind of throwaway comment friends make to each other. But his voice caught slightly on the word ruined, and when I turned to look at him fully, he was smiling that slow, deliberate smile that always made my chest tighten. I should have laughed it off, should have made a joke about his dating life, or changed the subject to something safer. Instead, I found myself studying his face in the dim light, looking for clues about how serious he was, how much of that song had been about us. He didn't look away. That was what undid me. The way he held my gaze like he was offering me something precious and fragile, like he'd been waiting for permission to say those words out loud. And now that they were hanging in the air between us, he wasn't going to take them back. The silence stretched longer than it should have, loaded with possibilities neither of us had been brave enough to name before. Festival sounds continued around us, distant laughter and music from other stages, but they felt separate from this moment, this quiet confession that changed everything. That night, lying in the motel room with Elliot's steady breathing a few feet away, I stared at the water-stained ceiling and tried to process what had happened. The song, the words, the way he'd smiled like ruining someone could be a gift instead of a tragedy. I'd spent months telling myself our friendship was just friendship, that the intensity one felt was normal, manageable. But Elliot's performance had stripped away that comfortable fiction, left us both exposed in a way that felt terrifying and inevitable all at once. I closed my eyes and listened to him breathe, wondering when my life had become so completely tangled in someone else's, and what it meant that I didn't want to untangle it. The drive home from the festival was quiet in a way that felt different from our usual comfortable silences. Elliot kept his eyes on the road while I stared out the passenger window at farmland rolling past in neat, predictable rows. We talked about surface things, the other performers we'd heard, the quality of the festival food, anything that didn't require us to acknowledge what had happened the night before. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the space between us, in the way Elliot's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, in the careful distance he maintained when we stopped for gas. We were both pretending that confession hadn't happened, that those words hadn't been spoken, but the pretense felt fragile, like a soap bubble that would burst if we breathed too hard. In the weeks that followed, our friendship deepened in ways that were both subtle and profound. Elliot started showing me his unfinished songs before anyone else, calling me over to his apartment at odd hours when inspiration struck. I'd find him hunched over his guitar or keyboard, hair disheveled from running his hands through it, surrounded by crumpled papers covered in crossed-out lyrics. "Listen to this," he'd say, and play something raw and unpolished, something that felt like looking directly into his heart. I became his first audience, his sounding board, the person who heard his music before it was ready for the world. There was an intimacy to those moments that went beyond friendship, though neither of us named it as such. I started sketching more, inspired by his lyrics in ways I couldn't fully explain. Abstract pieces that tried to capture the emotions his words evoked, visual interpretations of melodies that lived in my head long after he'd stopped playing. I didn't show them to him at first, these illustrations that felt too revealing, too much like admissions I wasn't ready to make. But one evening, while he was in the kitchen making coffee, I left one of my sketchbooks open on his coffee table. A piece inspired by that song from the festival, all flowing lines and warm colors that somehow captured the feeling of falling without fear. When he came back and saw it, he went very still. "This is about my song," he said, not quite a question. I nodded, suddenly nervous. It felt like another kind of confession, this visual response to his music. Like I was admitting how deeply his words had affected me, how they'd lodged themselves in my chest and demanded artistic response. He studied the sketch for a long time, tracing the lines with his eyes. Then he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between wonder and recognition. "No one's ever done that before," he said quietly. "Made art from my music." Our eyes met across the cluttered space of his living room, and for a moment, the careful choreography of our friendship faltered. There was something in his gaze that made my breath catch, the same intensity I'd seen on stage when he'd sung those lyrics directly to me. The nights started stretching later after that. Conversations that began with music and meandered into territory we'd never explored before. Elliot told me about his childhood, about feeling different in a small town where different was dangerous. I found myself sharing things I'd never said out loud, about the loneliness that had followed me through careful relationships, about the sense that I'd been waiting for something without knowing what. One evening in late September, we got caught in a sudden downpour walking home from a bar in his neighborhood. The rain came down in sheets, soaking us to the skin before we could find shelter. We ran laughing through empty streets, our footsteps echoing off wet pavement, until we reached his apartment building. In his kitchen, dripping and breathless, we collapsed into laughter that felt almost hysterical. Elliot's hair was plastered to his forehead, and his shirt clung to his frame in a way that made me look away quickly, then look back despite myself. When he reached up to push wet strands out of his eyes, I found myself stepping closer without thinking. "Here," I said, my voice rougher than intended. "Let me." I reached up to brush a strand of hair behind his ear, the gesture innocent enough until my fingers made contact with his skin. Then everything stopped. The laughter died in our throats, and the air between us became electric with possibility. My hand was still touching his face, fingers against his jaw, and neither of us moved to break the contact. We were close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin despite the rain that had soaked us both. Time seemed suspended, stretched thin between what we were and what we could become. I could feel his breath against my face, could see the way his lips parted slightly, and something in my chest cracked open. Then his phone rang, shrill and insistent from the living room, and the spell broke. We stepped apart quickly, the moment dissolving like sugar in water. Elliot went to answer the call while I stood alone in his kitchen, my hand still tingling from where it had touched his skin, my heart beating too fast against my ribs. But something had changed in that frozen moment, something we couldn't pretend hadn't happened. The air between us became charged after that, heavy with acknowledgement of whatever was building between us. Every accidental touch felt deliberate, every lingering glance carried weight we couldn't ignore. I started questioning everything. The safe choices I'd made, the quiet loneliness I'd accepted as normal, the careful distance I maintained from anything that might require real vulnerability. Elliot's presence in my life had become a catalyst, forcing me to examine the ways I'd been sleepwalking through my own existence. Late at night, alone in my apartment, I'd find myself thinking about that moment in his kitchen. The way he'd looked at me, the way time had seemed to stop, the possibility that had hung between us like a bridge neither of us had been brave enough to cross. I'd think about his confession at the festival, about the way he'd smiled when he said I'd ruined him, like ruin could be a gift. I began to understand that what I felt for Elliot went beyond friendship, beyond the careful boundaries I'd constructed around my heart. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a recognition that felt like coming home to a place I'd never known I was looking for. The realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, a door opening onto territory I'd never allowed myself to explore. Our friendship had become something else entirely, though we still moved around it carefully, like archaeologists handling something precious and fragile. Every shared meal, every late-night conversation, every moment of comfortable silence felt loaded with potential, with the possibility that we might finally name what was happening between us. But naming it would require courage neither of us had mustered yet, would mean stepping out of the safe ambiguity we'd created and into something real and risky and transformative. For now, we existed in that liminal space between friendship and something more, both of us aware of the electricity, but neither quite ready to flip the switch. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in October, when the air had turned crisp and the city felt like it was settling into autumn. Elliot had found a bigger apartment across town, closer to the venues where he played, and I'd volunteered to help him pack. It seemed like the kind of thing friends did for each other, the normal progression of a normal friendship. But nothing about us had been normal for months. I arrived at his old place to find boxes scattered everywhere, half filled with the detritus of his chaotic life. Books and sheet music, coffee mugs that had been repurposed as pencil holders, cables and picks, and the various fragments that accumulate around someone who lives for music. Elliot was sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding a notebook I didn't recognize, his expression unreadable. "Found this under the couch," he said when I walked in, not looking up from the pages. My stomach dropped before I even processed what he was holding. It was my notebook, the small leather-bound one I carried for sketches and observations, the one that must have fallen from my bag weeks ago during one of our movie nights. The one that contained things I'd never meant for anyone else to see. I should have asked for it back immediately, should have made some excuse about work notes or grocery lists. Instead, I stood frozen in his doorway, watching him read words I'd written in moments of vulnerability I thought were private. The entry he was reading was from late August, written the night after the festival, when I couldn't sleep for thinking about his performance. About the way he'd looked at me while singing about falling. I tried to process my feelings on paper, the way I sometimes did when emotions became too large to hold inside. "There's this boy," I'd written, "who feels like gravity and fire at the same time. Like coming home to a place I've never been. Like the answer to a question I didn't know I was asking." Elliot looked up at me then, and his expression was softer than I'd ever seen it. There was no teasing in his eyes, no awkwardness, just something that looked almost like relief. "Was that me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I could have lied, could have laughed it off, claimed it was about someone else, maintained the careful fiction we'd been constructing for months. But I was tired of pretending, tired of the weight of unspoken feelings, tired of moving around this thing between us like it was too fragile to touch. I nodded, the admission almost silent but somehow thunderous in the small space of his cluttered apartment. He set the notebook aside and stood up slowly, like he was afraid sudden movements might break whatever spell we'd fallen under. When he stepped closer, I could see the way his hands were trembling slightly, could feel the nervous energy radiating from him like heat. "Good," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "Because I wasn't kidding, you know. About you ruining me for girls." We were standing close enough that I could see the exact moment his expression shifted, the careful mask of friendship finally slipping away to reveal something raw and honest underneath. There was fear there, but also hope, and something that looked like the same recognition I'd been carrying for months. "I've been trying to write songs about other people," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Other experiences, other feelings. But everything I write comes back to you. Every melody, every lyrus, every stupid chord progression. It's all you." The confession hung between us like a bridge neither of us had been brave enough to build before. I could feel my heart beating too fast, could feel the careful walls I'd constructed around my feelings beginning to crumble. "Elliot," I started to say, but he shook his head. "Let me finish," he said. "Please. I need to say this while I still have the courage." He took a breath, steadying himself, then looked directly into my eyes with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "That night at the festival, when I said you'd ruined me, I meant it in the best possible way. You've ruined me for settling, for pretending to feel things I don't feel, for accepting less than this. Whatever this is." He gestured between us, encompassing the weight of months of careful dancing around each other, the accumulation of almost moments and unspoken admissions. "I don't know what I'm doing," he continued. "I don't know how to be in love with my best friend, how to want someone this much without destroying what we already have. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel it." The words "in love" hit me like a physical blow, knocked the breath from my lungs in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He'd said it, the thing we'd both been avoiding, the truth that had been building between us like pressure in a closed system. I reached up without thinking, the same gesture I'd made that night in the rain, fingers finding the familiar curve of his jaw. This time, he leaned into the touch instead of pulling away, his eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. "You haven't ruined anything," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "You've just shown me what I was missing. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with something that looked like relief and terror in equal measure. We were close enough that I could feel his breath against my face, could see the way his lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something else, but couldn't find the words. Instead of speaking, he rested his forehead against mine, the gesture so intimate it made my chest ache. We stood like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, finally allowing ourselves to acknowledge the gravity that had been pulling us together for months. "I'm scared," he whispered, and I could hear the vulnerability in his voice, the courage it took to admit fear in the midst of confession. "Me too," I admitted, because it was true. This felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, like one step forward would change everything irrevocably. But it also felt like coming alive after months of sleepwalking through my own life. We stayed like that, foreheads touching, hands finding each other's faces, until the fear began to transform into something else. Something that felt like coming home, like recognition, like the answer to every question I'd been afraid to ask. When we finally kissed, it was soft and tentative, a question asked and answered in the same breath. It tasted like possibility and terror and relief all at once, like the end of one story and the beginning of another. And when we broke apart, breathless and laughing nervously, Elliot smiled that crooked smile that had undone me from the beginning. "Still ruined?" I asked, and he laughed, the sound bright and free in the cluttered space of his old apartment. "Completely," he said, pulling me closer. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." The panic came later, as panic always does, creeping in during the quiet moments when the initial euphoria of confession had faded. We'd spent the rest of that Thursday night talking in his half-packed apartment, sitting close enough that our knees touched, hands finding each other's with the tentative wonder of people discovering something they'd been afraid to reach for. But in the days that followed, reality settled over me like a heavy blanket. What we'd acknowledged changed everything, transformed the comfortable ambiguity of our friendship into something that demanded definition, commitment, risk. The safe distance I'd maintained from real vulnerability was gone, burned away in the moment Elliot had said he was in love with me, in the breath before I'd kissed him back. I found myself lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the familiar water stain on my ceiling and cataloging everything that could go wrong. What if this intensity we felt was just novelty, the thrill of crossing a line we'd drawn for ourselves? What if stepping into something real with Elliot meant losing the easy friendship that had become the center of my world? What if I wasn't brave enough to be the person he thought he loved? The questions multiplied in the dark, each one feeding the next until I felt like I was drowning in possibility and terror in equal measure. I'd spent years building a life that was safe, predictable, contained. Elliot was chaos and passion and reckless heart, everything I'd taught myself to be cautious about. On Saturday, he called to ask if I wanted to come over and help finish packing. His voice was careful, like he was testing the waters of this new dynamic between us, unsure how to navigate the space we'd created. I said yes because I always said yes to him, but my stomach was tight with anxiety as I walked the familiar route to his apartment. I found him in his kitchen, wrapping dishes in newspaper with the methodical focus he brought to everything that mattered to him. When he looked up and smiled, the same crooked smile that had been undoing me for months, something in my chest clenched with both love and fear. "Hey," he said, and the single word carried the weight of everything that had changed between us. "Hey," I replied, suddenly hyper-aware of how to stand, where to put my hands, whether the distance between us was appropriate for whatever we were now. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, falling back into the easy rhythm we'd always shared. But I could feel him watching me, could sense the questions he wasn't asking, the careful way he was gauging my mood. Finally, he set down the plate he'd been wrapping and turned to face me fully. "You're scared," he said, not an accusation but an observation delivered with the gentle accuracy he'd always possessed when reading my emotions. I could have denied it, could have deflected with humor or changed the subject to safer ground. Instead, I found myself nodding, the admission feeling both shameful and necessary. "Terrified," I said, "because if we were doing this, if we were being honest, then I needed to be honest about all of it." He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the faint scent of sandalwood that always clung to his clothes. When he reached for my hands, I let him take them, let him anchor me in the moment instead of the spiral of anxiety I'd been caught in. Of what? He asked gently. Everything, I said, the word coming out rougher than I intended. Of this being too good to be real. Of not knowing how to love someone the way you deserve to be loved. Of my father's voice in my head every Sunday asking about nice girls. Of losing you if this doesn't work. He was quiet for a long moment, processing my fears with the same thoughtfulness he brought to his music. When he spoke, his voice was steady, certain in a way that made something in my chest settle. I'm not asking you to figure everything out tonight, he said. I'm not asking you to have answers for your father or anyone else. I'm just asking if you want to be here with me, if this feels worth trying despite the fear. The simplicity of the question undid me. Not whether I loved him, not whether I was ready to redefine my entire understanding of myself, just whether I wanted to be here, in this moment, with him. The answer to that had never been in question. Yes, I said, my voice breaking slightly on the word. More than anything. He smiled then, soft and relieved, like he'd been holding his breath waiting for my response. When he kissed me this time, it felt less tentative than it had in his old apartment, more like a promise than a question. I kissed him back with the desperation of someone who'd been drowning and finally found air. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, the gesture that had become our signature, our way of finding each other across whatever distance fear tried to create. We don't have to have it all figured out, he said quietly. We just have to be willing to figure it out together. The fear didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed into something more manageable, something that felt like anticipation rather than dread. This thing between us was going to require courage I wasn't sure I possessed, vulnerability I'd spent years avoiding, conversations with family and friends that would challenge assumptions I'd never questioned. But looking at Elliot, seeing the way he was willing to step into uncertainty with me, I felt something shift in my chest. Maybe courage wasn't about not being afraid. Maybe it was about being afraid and choosing love anyway. That night, after we'd finished packing his kitchen and ordered takeout from the Thai place that knew his usual order, we sat on his couch surrounded by boxes and talked about what came next. Not the big questions about labels or futures, just the immediate, practical things. How to navigate this new dynamic, how to tell our friends, how to be together without losing the friendship that had brought us here. It felt like planning a journey to somewhere we'd never been, using a map written in a language we were still learning to read. But as Elliot fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, his breathing evening out into the rhythm I'd memorized from countless nights on couches and in motel rooms, I thought maybe that was exactly what love was supposed to feel like. An adventure into the unknown, with the right person by your side. When I finally closed my eyes, the fear was still there, but it was accompanied by something stronger, something that felt like coming home to myself for the first time. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges we'd face them together. And that, I realized, was worth any amount of uncertainty. 3 weeks later, Elliot performs at Meridian on a Thursday night that feels different from all the Thursday nights that came before. I'm sitting at the bar this time instead of lurking in the back, close enough to catch his eye when he looks for me in the crowd. Close enough that when he introduces his last song as something new, something personal, I can see the small smile that's meant just for me. The song is called Ruin and Rescue, and when he starts to play, I recognize the melody immediately. It's evolved from that rough demo he'd hummed in his apartment weeks ago, transformed into something fuller, more complete. The lyrics are about finding home in unexpected places, about the way some people change you just by existing in your orbit, about how being ruined can be the most generous gift someone can give you. He doesn't look directly at me while he sings, but I can feel the song washing over me like a confession made public. The audience is captivated, leaning forward in their seats, and I realize I'm witnessing something significant. Not just another open mic performance, but the birth of something that could carry him places we've only dreamed about. When the song ends, the applause is longer and more enthusiastic than usual. People linger instead of checking their phones or heading to the bar, and I watch Elliot's face light up with the kind of joy that comes from connecting with strangers through music. This is what he was meant for, I think. This sharing of himself, this alchemy of turning private emotions into something universal. After his set, he makes his way through the small crowd of people who want to talk to him, shake his hand, ask about upcoming shows. I give him space to bask in the attention, but when our eyes meet across the room, he smiles in a way that makes my chest warm. Later, that smile seems to say, after this, when it's just us. The cover art for Ruin and Rescue sits on the table in front of me, printed on heavy cardstock that catches the bar's dim lighting. It's one of my designs, abstract lines that flow like water or wind, warm colors that somehow capture the feeling of falling without fear. Seeing my art paired with his music feels like the completion of something we started months ago without realizing it. When the crowd finally thins and Elliot can break away, he slides onto the bar stool next to me, still buzzing with performance energy. His hair is slightly damp with sweat, and his eyes are bright with the particular satisfaction that comes from a set gone well. "What did you think?" he asks, though he already knows the answer from my expression. "I think you're going to be playing much bigger venues soon," I tell him, and mean it. "The song was incredible, Elliot." "Really?" He ducks his head slightly, still not entirely comfortable with praise, but I can see the pleasure my words give him. When he looks up again, his expression is softer, more intimate despite the public setting. "I couldn't have written it without you," he says quietly. "Any of it." We walk home together through streets that feel familiar but somehow different, like the city has rearranged itself around our new understanding of each other. It's one of those perfect autumn nights when the air is crisp but not cold, when the streetlights cast everything in warm amber and the world feels full of possibility. At his apartment, we settle into what has become our new normal. Elliot tunes his guitar while I sketch in the margins of a magazine, the comfortable domesticity of two people who have stopped pretending they don't belong in each other's spaces. His new place is slowly taking shape, becoming home in the way his old apartment never quite managed. There are my books mixed in with his on the shelves, my coffee mug in his kitchen cabinet, my toothbrush in his bathroom. The changes happen gradually, organically, like we were both finally allowing ourselves to take up the space we've been circling for months. No dramatic conversations about moving in together, just the quiet accumulation of shared life, the way relationships deepen when people stop fighting against gravity. From where I sit on his couch, surrounded by the gentle chaos of instruments and notebooks and the visual evidence of our intertwined lives, I can see the navy blue shirt I'd held that first evening, now hanging in his closet where it belongs. The sight makes me smile, thinking about how far we've traveled from that moment of uncertainty to this one of quiet contentment. Elliot starts playing something new, a melody I haven't heard before, and I look up from my sketching to find him watching me with that expression I've come to love, the one that says he's storing this moment away like a photograph. The lamplight catches the gold in his eyes, and I'm struck again by how beautiful he is, how miraculous it feels that someone like him chose someone like me. "Still ruined for girls?" I ask, the question that has become our private joke, our shorthand for everything we've built together. He grins, setting down his guitar to pull me closer on the couch until I'm tucked against his side, his arm around my shoulders like it was always meant to be there. "Completely," he says, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "Utterly and entirely ruined, and grateful for it every single day." Outside, the city continues its evening song, but here in the warm circle of light cast by his lamp, surrounded by the quiet evidence of our love, everything feels perfectly still. Elliot hums softly against my hair, working out the melody for another song, while I sketch abstract patterns that might someday become album covers or might just be the visual representation of contentment. This is what happiness looks like, I think. Not fireworks or grand gestures, but this quiet domesticity, this easy coexistence of two people who found each other despite themselves. The fear I carried for weeks has transformed into something else entirely, into gratitude for the courage that brought us here, into anticipation for all the songs yet to be written, all the art yet to be created, all the ordinary evenings that stretch ahead of us like gifts. When I finally close my sketchbook and settle more fully against him, Elliot's humming evolves into actual words, lyrics about coming home and letting go and the particular kind of ruin that feels like salvation. I close my eyes and let his voice wash over me, thinking about how some kinds of ruin are really just another word for beginning, another way of saying you've finally stopped running from the thing you've wanted most.